Hey everybody, welcome to the Dan and Steve Show, episode number 3. I'm Dan.
And I'm Steve.
We were really pleased to hear everybody's suggestions and requests on the last show. We got another great response to the last episode, I thought, Steve.
Yeah, we did. Lots of great comments and suggestions for how we should move forward with other stories.
Yeah, I mean, no one's really excited about the thing that we're talking about today, it seemed like.
I didn't
Because,
want to say it, but
yeah, because I'm the only person that likes Doctor Strange, apparently. But we will talk about it nonetheless. So the topic of discussion today is Doctor Strange: A Separate Reality. This is a set of issues written by Steve Engelhart and drawn by Frank Brunner. This came out in like 1974, 1975, I believe. And this is in my mind of what I've read of Doctor Strange. I haven't read everything. I'm definitely not as well versed in it as I am, some like Spider-Man. But I've read like the Ditko stuff, some of the Roger Stern run, Ryan K. Vaughan's miniseries, Mark Waid's miniseries. So I've read a good amount of Doctor Strange, and this is one of my favorite Doctor Strange things I've read. And I wanted to show it to Steve because Doctor Strange has a lot of Eastern philosophy infused into the story and what it's all about. And I figured that would be right up Steve's alley. And
yes.
he wasn't someone that had read a whole lot of Doctor Strange. I think you had some exposure to the character. You've read like some of the Lee and Ditko stuff, haven't you?
Yeah, I've read some of that. I got the first Masterworks back at home, and that's something I've read, but it's been a few years, so I'm definitely nowhere near as well versed as you are in it.
Yeah, and the thing with the Lee Ditko stuff is it takes a while to hit its stride because a lot of the stories, when it starts out, they're kind of like haunted house stories, and they're only 8
Yeah.
pages long, so they don't get to do a lot because Doctor Strange was sharing strange tales with some of the characters at the time when he first appeared. But now, this is like 70s Doctor Strange. We fully hit our stride. The book has an identity. It knows what it's all about, and we're just doing full issue stories. This trade has kind of like 3 stories that weave in and out of each other. There's sort of a plot at the beginning about Doctor Strange going through and different dimensions. He's going through different dimensions throughout the entire thing here. It's really sort of out there. But we see him fighting Shumagorath, and he goes inside the Ancient One's head and like fights his ego and things like that. And then we get Doctor Strange and Baron Mordo chasing a guy through time who's trying to amass all this magic power so that he can essentially become the Judeo-Christian god. And then the last story is all about Doctor Strange trapped in this sort of world where death isn't possible, no one has a soul, and he has to kind of grapple with the idea of what death is. And that's kind of the one uniting theme throughout the 3 stories is death. What does it mean? What is human existence futile if death is so inevitable? And what are we really accomplishing in the grand scheme of the universe and things like that? So, Steve, I want to give you the floor so you can talk a little bit about it. What was your initial impression of the writing and sort of the ideas that were in here?
Well, I'll make no bones about it. I loved this. I thought this was fantastic. Steve Englehart's a writer that I've read a good amount of, and he's one of those people where you see him in interviews and you can't understand why anyone would read his work, and then you read his work and it's brilliant. He's very much like Alan Moore in that way. Um, so I wasn't exactly sure what to expect, but yeah, I thought this was fantastic. Englehart's got a really interesting voice for Doctor Strange as opposed to people like Batman, because his Batman stories are extremely dark and gritty and more noir detective sort of stories, and the fact that he's able to do that and then simultaneously do some of the most bizarre stuff I've ever seen on page, it's pretty impressive in that way. But the ideas that you mentioned before and the Eastern philosophy influence, that's kind of what had me going throughout all of this. There's a great bit of people saying words and demon names and stuff like that um are just kind of arbitrary. Like this demons has like 6 syllables in his name because why not? But that's cool with me because what they mean and what they're trying to understand is also fascinating. The big idea, I think, at least what Eastern philosophy that I think they're pulling from is this concept of the eternal return, and I think that's extremely fascinating since this character in during the middle of the story, I think where the biggest portion of this really takes place with the demon that wants to become the Judeo-Christian god. He does that and then discovers sort of this sense of eternal return where everything repeats itself exactly the way it was in the first place. And the interesting thing about that is that eternal return's a concept that died out because of Christianity.
Oh,
So to have it
interesting.
be born because Christianity dies out in this book is extremely fascinating. It's not something that's talked about a lot. It kind of died out with Indian and Egyptian philosophy, but Friedrich Nietzsche talks about it a lot. Schopenhauer talks about it a lot. But the fact that you make it so the entire world just repeats itself, and so there's no greater purpose. Things just keep going in a cycle, and the way things were once are exactly how they'll be in the future and how they were in the past. And Doctor Strange has to realize that while he's going through time, while simultaneously dealing with the fact that he killed his master and he's trapped in a place where there's no such thing as death. So if the entire world is this weird circular Ouroboros kind of notion, what's the point of anything? And I thought that was great. He's extremely optimistic about it all the way through, though. I mean, not in a campy way, but even when he's dealing with like some of the horror and sort of the bigger questions of this, he never loses sight of the objective he has and the kind of moral principles he's guided by.
Hmm.
Like we spend a good portion of an issue just with Doctor Strange wrestling with the fact that he had to kill his master, and he took several oaths saying that he would not kill, and that kind of weighs on him, even though it's for the greater good.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I picked up on all that kind of philosophy stuff, and it really this is a really out there, heady kind of philosophical book, and I can see how Doctor Strange is not a thing for everyone because this is very much a cerebral thinkers kind of comic book. If you don't want to think and you just want to see people punch things, that's here. But I don't think you'll get all that much enjoyment out of it when you have to kind of slog through pages of stuff that you might not want to encounter in your journey in a superhero comic. But from a character development standpoint, I thought all of the stuff that was done with, especially Strange and the Judeo-Christian God, paralleling those two characters, what I thought was fascinating, because the kind of quest of the Judeo-Christian God is kind of to amass power and to amass knowledge at the same time. So he's sort of Baron Mordo and Doctor Strange in one character. And Doctor
Yeah.
Strange and Baron Mordo are chasing him through time, trying to convince him to side with one of them or the other. And I found it fascinating that Doctor Strange is also grappling throughout these three stories here that are interwoven with each other. The notion of the choices he has to make and whether he's worthy to make those sort of choices, calling into the question of what does free will really mean. And I think when you get to the Judeo-Christian God at the end, he gains all power and knowledge, and with that knowledge, he only has one choice, and the one choice is to not do anything. And that's totally contrary to how Doctor Strange sees things, but it doesn't really rattle him. I thought that was really interesting for his character. He's one of those characters where he'll go through these really weird and life-changing experiences, and it weighs on him. It's not like it's not like a contrived sort of way where he goes through these experiences and just doesn't change and it's static and boring. It definitely weighs on him the whole time, but he ultimately comes to the conclusion that he has to continue to do what he's doing, even though is free will even a thing? Is the universe already predestined by this God that he saw create the universe, and doesn't that God doesn't feel like he has a choice other than to just have things unfold ultimately? It's a really out there kind of question. And I loved that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think part of the reason, I don't have a lot of base for this, but based on this story alone, I think a lot of the reason Doctor Strange doesn't necessarily change is that since he's a person of magic, his whole focus, no matter what he's doing, is on the idea of becoming. So whatever is in the world is capable of not being in the world, and whatever is not in the world is capable of being in the world.
Hmm.
And every time he uses his magic or tries to fight Baron Mordo or tries to travel through time, there's a sense of everything's inevitable. He's sort of forced into circumstances, but he's still able to survive those circumstances with the knowledge that he has and the powers that he has, and that's really interesting because this idea of becoming and being forced into it, and so if everything's predestined, but there's still a notion of free will just in the fact that survival makes it so. And if you can imagine free will, if you can conceive of free will, then it's possible to make it somehow.
Yes.
I thought that's really interesting. There's a couple of pages of dialogue. I think near the end of the Judeo-Christian God story. I think that was the 14th issue of Marvel Premiere near the end there. where they have a lot of talk about the will and this idea of there's this unmovable mover at the start of things that forces everything to categorize. And so even though it comes back to where it was in the beginning, you're still moving and you're still being pushed in a direction. So it's still possible for direction to change a little bit. It's just that it hasn't yet. And I thought that's really cool.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting too. Um, all of that kind of questions about the universe is really what is driving this book forward, and I thought it was really interesting to start Doctor Strange in a place where when he sort of defeats the ego of the Ancient One talks about how to become one with the universe, you have to sort of let go of your sense of self, which is to just sort of give up your stake in the world, just become a part of it rather than trying to conquer it in any sort of way. And I think it's interesting that the sort of henchman guy of Shemaggorath that is commanding all of the minions in here was kind of like, he looked like Buddha and even called himself Buddha. It was like,
Yeah.
because
The living Buddha.
yeah, because that's sort of like Buddha's whole mantra is just to like give up all your worldly possessions and meditate all the time. And I mean, it's much more complicated than that. I'm definitely simplifying it. But I thought that was interesting. And then you have Doctor Strange talking with the Ancient One, and when he's one with the universe, he's sort of appearing in trees and in the sky and in the water, and he's saying that there is such thing as an afterlife, but it's just sort of joining in with the fabric of what makes up the universe. And it was very much like the Force in the way that I was thinking about it.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. I didn't think of that initially. But yeah, it is very much like the Force, and the god demon person has a dialogue near the end of his initial story where he talks about how human beings are imperfect, but because they're the only ones that are close to perfection, simply by virtue of being the only things that exist, they are perfect. And that's really interesting. So if you become one with the universe by the time you die, and then everything circles back, and you get the exact same sort of catalyst for the start of the universe. It makes this really interesting case for this anti Judeo-Christian idea of people aren't born bad. They're born good, and they're born with a very clear sense of purpose and direction because everything is part of the world and everything joins with the world by the end of their life cycle. And that really reminds me of some Buddhist philosophy, some Indian philosophy, and even some Greek stuff. Because by the time the Greek philosophers came around, they kind of abandoned a lot of this thought. But a couple pairs of them before even Socrates, Parmenides and Heraclitus would talk about how the world is either unchanging or it's changing, and in those contradictory positions, they realized that they were both saying the exact same thing: that the world is concerned with nothing but becoming. So whether you're part of the universe, whether you're predestined, or whether you're just stuck as an imperfect being, you're still part of the universe and you're still matter. And so even though you don't have any choice, there's still a reason to exist. And it's kind of beautifully simple in that way. Like Doctor Strange doesn't need the change because he's perfect the way he is because he's part of the world the way it is.
And I think he's supposed to be, at least in the context of this story, a representation of what the Judeo-Christian God says about humanity, in
Yeah.
that they're not perfect, but they're the closest thing conceivable to perfection that we can create at this time. So there's nothing he can do to change them that will make them any better. And Doctor Strange is always grappling about, oh, am I making the right decision here? Did I make a mistake? And all of this kind of stuff. He's just kind of an analog for what humanity is at its height in this. And I think Baron Mordo obviously is the representation of it at its worst, along with Silver Dagger, the Judeo-Christian fanatic in the last story, who's the villain, ironically enough. And I thought he was really interesting because here's a guy that's so fanatically devoted to this religion, and he, like you said, believes that some people are just born evil and they need to be destroyed because they're scourge of the earth. He compares his mission to that of the Inquisition, in that you need to root out the evil in the world, and he's the sole arbiter of who is good and who is evil. And he just goes around and kills people that he believes to be demons, and the people that have been supposedly brainwashed into the cult of the demon, and they have to be brought to see the light into his point of view.
Yeah, and interestingly, his whole notions of people being born bad and the strangest place in the universe is founded on an error. So it's hard to sympathize with him, but that's what makes him so interesting. That he's a fanatic to something that he doesn't understand fully. But Strange does. So Strange is both a symbol for humanity as well as like a greater concept of what humanity could be because they're focusing on, or because Strange is focusing on more than just his self.
Right.
Um, yeah, and that's really great. And when you get near the end and you get some of the stuff with Silver Surfer, that sort of ties back together because Silver Surfer is also always dealing with those kind of Descartes-esque questions of the unreal and the real, and some beliefs being found on error. So what can you know certainly? And so it's interesting that you'd pair those two characters together of Doctor Strange and Silver Surfer because they're both representations of humanity, but they're representations of humanity's best self possible.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'd like to go back at some point because I've never delved into the back issues of this book. But Doctor Strange and Silver Surfer are longtime teammates on the Defenders, the classic team. It's Hulk, Silver Surfer, Doctor Strange, and a couple of other characters. I would imagine those issues must be really interesting because I had the
Yeah.
same sort of thoughts that you did. Because I've heard you talk about Silver Surfer all the time. You're like, oh, he's just kind of Socrates in space. And I was like, oh, that's interesting that
Yeah, it's awesome.
we're pairing these two characters that are so philosophy focused in the same book. And when I read this the first time, that hadn't really occurred to me. I think some of this stuff was over my head the first time I read it.
Right.
And I think some of the stuff that's cool about this as well is some of the analogs to like Alice in Wonderland and classic literature and things like that. Like we get the caterpillar that's smoking hookah in here, and Strange gets to talk to him when he's trapped in that realm that has no one has souls and nobody can die, and it's sort of like the anti-heaven, not in the way that hell is, where your soul is damned and you're like punished for the rest of your days. It's just sort of like you don't have a soul and you can't die and it's miserable. Like no one's torturing you. It's just sort of you exist and there's nothing to do other than talk to a caterpillar and try to kill yourself. And I found it to be very ironic. Of course, it's the most fitting end to the story possible, where the Judeo-Christian fanatic guy, the Silver Dagger, is trapped in there because he spent his whole life sort of being the arbiter of who's good and who's bad, and then he himself is trapped in a place where he gets to live forever, but it's kind of miserable and not in the way that he had anticipated. He's not being like chained to some place and being whipped and burnt with fire and brimstone.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's interesting. And so no one in that very particular space, that weird unreal world inside Doctor Strange's orbs can die, but they also don't seem like they have any choice. Like they keep cycling back and have the same sort of pattern of thought over and over again, and Strange's existence is the only thing that's changing things. And I thought that was interesting because it's really counter to the previous story where Strange's existence didn't mean anything by the end of the story. And that's kind of a really good way to bring him out of his rut because now there are dimensions and there are places and there are peoples where Strange's powers have impact. And the best way to get rid of a villain that's trying to undermine that impact is by trapping him in a place where he has no choice but to live in this circular existence that he was denying the whole time.
And I think that's a really good point because I think that's the thing that's so alluring to him when he's trapped in the orb of Agamotto. He says that it's a very alluring prospect for me to just live in this world forever because this is the place where I can affect and change things in a more grandiose way than I can in the real world. So if he wanted to live in sort of a matrix-like existence where he was living in a fake world that was kind of his ideal existence, right? He's a superhero. He wants to go around and fight these cosmic entities to make the world a better place and protect it from the threats that most people can't perceive or understand. And he just found out that nothing he can do will ever, in the grand scheme of things, change things in the real world. And then he gets a world where that is possible. His entire worldview that he's had his whole life is reaffirmed, and it's really interesting to see him give all of that up.
Yeah, and it's really counter to just classic storytelling of you live in a world with no choice, so you make a world of choice. Like everything like The Matrix uses that dichotomy, but this story does the exact opposite. You give us a world where you have choice, and you realize that's the bad world, and you need to go to the one that doesn't really have a choice. I thought that was really interesting because it's not as idealistic in the sense that, well, don't worry, you can make things better. It's more of just accepting the truth and making that better. And that it's really strange that something so high concept and so high philosophical would at the end of the day say, don't focus on what ought to be and all these grand notions of self and personhood and morality. Just focus on what is and keep going.
Right, exactly. And I think one of the interesting things about that notion is when the Judeo-Christian God is before he amasses all of his power, we see him in like ancient Sodom and Gomorrah before they're destroyed, and of course, he's the one that destroys them. But he's talking about how imperfect the humans are. Baron Morda kind of convinces him, and the god sort of like destroys the cities in an attempt to change things, like you were talking about, and it doesn't really have any sort of effect once we get to the end, and it sort of makes sense out of a Judeo-Christian philosophical contradiction in that we see a god that's very interventionist in the times that it chronicles in the early books like Revelation and Genesis and stuff,
Right.
and then I guess for the rest of the time he's just like, all right guys, you're on your own. And he just doesn't intervene at all for whatever reason. But in this, it makes a whole lot of sense because he has a finite set of actions that will always happen in this loop where the god goes back and does these things, and then retroactively in the past has more knowledge and knows those things because he's traveling backwards in time, and then wouldn't do anything other than the actions that are already predestined that he made before but are in the future when he was less knowledgeable.
Yeah.
It's crazy to kind of parse it all out, but it makes perfect sense in the story.
Oh yeah, it totally does. He talks about, and I thought this was interesting because no one ever touches on this, at least in the fantasy I've read. But there's a very finite amount of magic in the world, and so the less users there are, the more powerful each individual one can become.
Mm-hmm.
But by the future that this god character comes from, there are so many that everyone has just a very limited amount of power, and so they can't really do anything. Everyone's exactly the same. And when he gets all the power, when he becomes essentially the controller of all the finite magic in the universe, he realizes that you're ultimately most powerful when you don't have any of it, or when you have less of it. And that's interesting because he's not really the bad guy at the end of the day. He's just someone that's really curious about the nature of humanity because he's so far removed from it. And he's kind of the perfect concept that, assuming everyone becomes as good as Doctor Strange, you'd get the world that this guy comes from. And if Doctor Strange is ever successful in his mission of protecting the world and everyone becomes sort of a sorcerer, that's exactly where you'd go. But then you end it off and say that having too much magic or having too little magic still makes you human. And
Yeah.
being human's pretty much enough. It's just a matter of what the concept of humanity for that time period is. Strange is superhuman right now, but shifted ahead 100 years and he's not anymore. And that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting now that you say that Doctor Strange's mission is sort of to protect the world and teach other people how to use magic. In a way, when you think about it, Doctor Strange created God inadvertently.
Yeah.
Which, again, is sort of a contradiction in Judeo-Christian philosophy where, God created humans, but who created God? Where'd he come from? That question's never brought up or answered. And Doctor Strange is the answer to that question in the Marvel Universe, and that's super cool.
Yeah. It's really interesting. It seems like Marvel's at least theological views are more consistent than DC's, because DC's got like multiple pantheons that coexist and they don't make any sense. Like Green Arrow died and went to the Christian heaven, but Deadman gets his powers from the Hindu pantheon,
Oh.
and they both serve the exact same purpose, so it doesn't really make any sense.
I mean, Marvel has it a little bit convoluted too. Like, there's a Thor story where he fights like the Egyptians and the Greeks and the other pantheons and stuff too. So they do exist simultaneously. And of course, we have Hercules, who was on the Avengers for a while, and
Yeah.
he's at his own book and stuff. So I don't know about all that stuff, but at least with the Judeo-Christian God, I would love to see Matt Murdock and Doctor Strange sit down and have a conversation about this.
Oh yeah, and I believe they've had it a couple of times. Like there's a good number of Daredevil stories where he goes to Doctor Strange for advice, and the biggest one being Born Again,
Mm.
not Born Again, Guardian Devil, I mean.
Yes, yes.
He talks about him in Guardian Devil. And Doctor Strange is a pretty prominent character in Ghost Rider. Every one of Ghost Rider has a appearance by Doctor Strange, and that's very much a Judeo-Christian influenced story.
Yeah, I wanted to mention this. I think this is a good segue into what I wanted to bring up. This corner of the Marvel universe, because Doctor Strange, at least in these stories, he's become a more prominent member. Joining the New Avengers on Bendis's run and doing some stuff there. But Doctor Strange has his own pocket of the Marvel universe that's unique than all of the other characters, I think, and that's what I like about him so much. Doctor Strange just kind of exists in his own ethereal being. He just has dimensions that he hops through. Nobody knows what he's doing. The only reason that the other superheroes in the Marvel universe are able to persist and do what they do is because Doctor Strange is preemptively fighting these interdimensional threats that they have no idea about.
Yeah, Doctor Strange is protecting the metaphysical world that the rest of the Marvel universe doesn't even know exists, and that's great. Even characters in his little family or his little section of Marvel, like Ghost Rider, even they don't do stuff that important. The most Ghost Rider's ever done in terms of fighting cosmological or ontological problems is fight Satan one time.
Yeah.
But Doctor Strange is out there saving reality itself every other week. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and I think the cool thing about Doctor Strange is he's probably the most powerful character in the Marvel universe when you think about it.
Yeah.
Because potentially, Doctor Strange, if he was evil, could just use the book that the Judeo-Christian God dude wrote to go back in time and erase any potential threat that he ever wanted to from existence. So he's definitely the most powerful. But the thing that is interesting about him is that he's so human in that he doesn't want to have control over everyone's lives like Baron Mordo and the Judeo-Christian God do initially.
Um, and oh man, now I've got 2 points I really want to make, but one of them is are all other Doctor Strange stories as intellectual as this? Because I mean, I've read the early Lee Ditko stuff in that first Masterworks, which wasn't great. It was fun, but it wasn't great. And then Doctor Strange season 1, which I didn't really care for. None of them had anywhere near the amount of ideas this book has in one page, as opposed to full graphic novels.
Once Steve Ditko kind of gets to get loose, and it's after the first volume, that's when we introduce stuff like Eternity, which is a being that is representative of the concept of eternity, and just defines what sort of things will happen in the universe, and if you gaze into eternity, you get to see what fate has deemed for you and stuff like that. There's a lot of really philosophical ideas later when Stan Lee is a little bit more hands off with it. Because basically, after a while, and this was true of when Ditko was on Spider-Man 2, after a while, Ditko was basically plotting everything, and Lee was just making dialogue. He wasn't even involved in the issue-to-issue plotting or characterization of the book. Ditko would just do whatever he wanted, and Lee would put words in their mouth.
Right.
So after Doctor Strange gets more pages, and we're able to do some more out there things with him, it gets like this. This stuff is very much based and pulls from a lot of the stuff that happens in Ditko. We even see Eternity in this book briefly, when Doctor Strange is in one of the various black dimensions that he's in here. It happens quite a bit. So yeah, it does get this intellectual, but it doesn't last very long because Ditko had a pretty good run. It was maybe 20 issues where he was doing his intellectual philosophical thing, and then he left Marvel completely. And Lee didn't want anything to do with Doctor Strange anymore, so they put Danny O'Neill and a different artist on it. And the next issue immediately is Doctor Strange shopping for clothes in New York City in Greenwich Village, and it's weird.
That's really strange.
Yeah.
Danny O'Neill has bad luck with Marvel characters that aren't Iron Man.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read a ton of Denny O'Neill's stuff, but yeah, what I've read, it's just not in the same spirit as this, and I think they were trying to make it a little bit more accessible because certainly writing Doctor Strange like this isn't going to get you to sell a ton of books. I would doubt very much if moving forward we get a Doctor Strange comic book that's anything like this.
Yeah, I agree. This is really out there. This is a kind of comic I haven't read from anyone except like Grant Morrison, and the only reason he gets away with it is because he's got a reputation for it.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, and this is goes back to the other point I want to make. But like, you get characters in here like Baron Mordo that are essentially just personifications of slave morality, and you're doing like high concept 18th century philosophy with these people, and it's not about the characterizations as much as it's about the ideas and the worlds they interact in, and that's not for everybody. And even if you can write it so it's accessible to everyone, there are very few people that are going to like it on that level.
Yeah, exactly, and I think you're spot on about the 18th century philosophy point. This the writing in this is so tight, and everything matters. Every single detail has some sort of connotation as to what the theme of the story is about. The first place that they travel back in time to when they're chasing God through time is 18th century Paris.
Yes.
And that's when we get Baron Mordo and Doctor Strange's conflict, where that begins. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss little details like that. But I'm sure for the both of us, we were reading through this and we're like, man, this is just a tour de force.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I really wish I made more notes about it because this is really dense. This is something I wish I had time to go back and read a couple more times.
I agree.
Um, because there's just so much going on. If I had any issue at all, and this isn't really an issue because it's not their story, but Wong and his student don't get a lot to do.
Yeah,
And
Klee
they
and
aren't
Wong.
particularly interesting. Like Wong has one moment where he's about to use the martial arts he's trained in to attack Silver Dagger, and then Silver Dagger just kicks him and it's over.
Yeah.
And it's kind of pathetically funny.
And Klee does have a little bit of the damsel in distress thing going on for a while.
Yeah, and I mean that's not even really a criticism because this is part of I imagine a longer run and it's in between other issues, so they definitely get stuff to do before or after this. Just not in this particular story.
Yeah, Klee's a really cool character in the Ditko stuff when she's introduced. She's from the Dark Dimension, which is where Dormammu reigns.
Oh,
And
cool.
she's one of his subjects, and she's involved with helping Strange dethrone Dormammu in the Dark Dimension and stuff like that. If you read any of that stuff when Dormammu is introduced, that's like high concept out there Ditko stuff. It's great. And that's another thing that was called back to too. I liked when Doctor Strange is kind of in the Ancient One's mind, and we get flashbacks to some of the early Ditko stuff. It's very clear that Engelhart and Brunner have a huge reverence for that era because
Yeah.
they pull from it and go back to it all the time.
Oh yeah. This is really interesting stuff, and Steve Englehart's a writer that usually likes to tell his own story. He likes to have a lot of villains and stuff in there, but it's never, at least from the DC stuff I've read, it's never like, let's go back and do as much Golden Age reference as possible. He's very particular about his work. So if anything's even remotely similar, he'll call it plagiarism. Um, but it's interesting that you bring that up. That this guy really likes the Marvel universe, and he's making sure there's continuity tiebacks and things that are going in to a bigger, grander story in the continuity of the character. And he's just one small writer in it. He's very humble in the way he's writing this book, as opposed to what I've seen later.
Yeah, it's I've heard him talk about like how he thought like the Batman movies like plagiarized his work, and like I'm
Yeah.
sure there's influence there, and his Batman run I've heard is one of the better ones. But
Oh yeah, it's spectacular.
yeah, but I just don't agree with some of the points that he made about how they plagiarize and things like that, like you said. Um,
Yeah,
this
like he says stuff like Dark Knight is just straight up ripoffs of his Strange Apparition story. I'm like, no, no, it's not at all.
Yeah, maybe it borrows characterization, but I don't think so. I think if anything,
Barely.
it's more similar to the Long Halloween than anything.
Yeah, Englehart's influence is such that Harvey Dent's actor looks a little bit similar, and the Joker's there. That's about
The
it.
Joker's in the story.
Yes, that's about it. Everything else is just stuff that's been in Batman stories before, and he does differently.
Now, speaking of movies, I want to talk briefly about this isn't necessarily well, it's kind of related to this book. just in a sort of general sense. So we know we're getting a Doctor Strange movie. Benedict Cumberbatch is going to be playing Doctor Strange. I'm very excited about this movie because
Agreed.
if you had told me that Marvel was going to make a Doctor Strange movie like 10 years ago, I would have laughed in your face because the comic book is like this. I was like, no one's going to go see a movie about Eastern philosophy. I'm the only person that likes that.
And me now,
Yeah,
apparently.
yeah, exactly. So uh, I would imagine that when we get the movie, it will borrow from some Doctor Strange stuff. We'll see some Doctor Strange iconography. But do you have any confidence that the movie will be this cerebral?
Um, a little. And I mean, it's not. I really doubt it's going to be as overtly cerebral as this is. Like this book just stops and lets people talk about ideas in dialogue for 6 pages.
Yeah.
I doubt the movie is going to do that. That's a little bit further out. But given Guardians and given Winter Soldier, given Iron Man 3, and given Age of Ultron, I feel like it will be cerebral. It will definitely be true to the character. It will definitely be a risk. But yeah, I don't think it's necessarily going to keep the type of writing that this book has. A lot of what we get in that movie will probably just be implied ideas as opposed to explicit ideas.
Do you think there's any chance they might borrow some of the plots from this run? Because I mean, among Doctor Strange fans, I know this is one of the most highly regarded runs on the character for good reason. I think.
Yeah.
I think it would be very cool to see. I mean, it's tough because dealing with religion in a comic book is one thing, but dealing with it in a blockbuster movie is really, really kind of a risky move. You might offend some people if you do something like that.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean we're talking about a franchise that has $2 billion films, another one that's expected to break 1 billion. So the only thing people are watching in the summer are comic book movies. If you get 1 billion people to go in and watch Doctor Strange and half of them don't agree with the religious politics, that's not good for business.
No, it's definitely not. I think the movie will very likely be Doctor Strange. You know, this is the origin where he kind of has Tony Stark from the movie's origin, where he's like really arrogant and doesn't want to help people and is all out for himself, and then his hands get messed up in a car accident, and he can't do the thing he's most passionate about in life, which is repair people and hold money. So he goes and tries to find the Ancient One and. To get his hands repaired and ends up being a better person by the time he's done training. And then I assume in the movie we'll at some point get the Dark Dimension, if not just kind of set up for that with Dormammu. I would imagine Barrymore will be the main villain in the movie. Um, but yeah, I just don't think that we're gonna have Doctor Strange like floating through ethereal planes and like contemplating the nature of of time and space and the universe and everything. Um,
Yeah.
it's definitely. I think it'll be a decent character study, and I think there'll be mentions about maybe Doctor Strange, what he's doing in the grand scheme of things is important and somewhat futile, but I don't think there'll be all that much grappling with those ideas as there is Doctor Strange shooting colorful bolts at Baron Mordo on the screen.
Yeah, part of me wishes we get a movie where Doctor Strange's origin isn't touched on, and we just cut to a different corner of the Marvel universe and tell a story like this. I
Mm.
doubt we'll get that. If I had to bet, I would say they're gonna do something extremely similar to the animated movie that we got.
Ugh.
Which I'm not happy about. I don't really like that movie very much, but I think you could improve on it and make something good out of it. I just wish we didn't have to do a Doctor Strange origin film
Yeah, I
because it's not
agree.
that complicated.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see how they characterize him because he's definitely a different character from Tony Stark after his origin, but the origin and the inciting incident is really similar, especially in the movies.
Yeah.
Um,
It's going to be interesting to see how much influence they have there because they've got a couple of characters now that are kind of Tony Stark-ish, but come away with different conclusions. So we'll see ultimately where they go with it. I don't think we actually have any information on it aside from who's directing and who's writing.
mhm.
And the director's a guy that did a few horror movies, and the writers are the guys that did the SpongeBob movie and Kung Fu Panda.
Really?
Yeah. But I'm learning not to trust those credits because James Gunn did some pretty terrible movies before Guardians.
That's true. That's true. I just think it's very. I just think it's really strange to tap the people who did the SpongeBob movie and Kung Fu Panda for a Doctor Strange movie. But what do I know? I'm not Kevin Feige.
Yeah, and I mean, it would have been crazy if you were in those meetings where they tapped producers on Community, a sitcom about community college, to do Winter Soldier.
That's true. Yeah.
So
So at this point, the level of quality that Marvel's been putting out at this point, I'm going to trust them and hope that the movie's great. I have to say what I said about Spider-Man, though. And it's even more of it's even more of a no-brainer in my mind for Doctor Strange. You got to make this into a Netflix show because Doctor Strange is the leader of the Defenders, man.
yeah, and there's rumors that he's going to be in the Iron Fist TV show.
Ooh, that would be awesome.
Oh, I know. And I mean, Cumberbatch is a mostly TV actor before he got really big, so I don't think he'd have a problem doing a Netflix show with Iron Fist.
Hey, and Netflix has enough money to pay him probably a better salary than he gets on most TV shows, so I wouldn't be
Exactly.
surprised. Hey, we're coming up on a half hour here, Steve. I'm sure we could sit here if we had taken notes and read the thing like 3 times. We could have had
Yeah.
like a 2 hour discussion about it. But I think we've come and covered the gambit here, at least in my mind. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we signed off here?
I think the last thing I want to mention is the art.
Oh yes, how could I forget? I wanted to mention that. I'm so sorry. Frank Brunner's art is fantastic, isn't it?
Yes, I love it, and particularly the colorist. I don't know who the colorist is, but he does an
So,
incredible job highlighting all the shades of yellow and red and blue, and it's some of the best coloring work I've seen in 70s comics.
it's David Hunt, at least for the first issue. I don't know if it changes later on, but yeah, I'm with you. I love the art in this. Frank Brunner is a guy that I've only seen his art in here. This is the only place I've been exposed to it, and man, this guy is amazing. There's very experimental
Yeah.
panel layouts. Just they're worthy of how experimental the story is. It's a perfect fit.
Yeah, and I mean we get a moment where there is a two-page spread, and in 70s comics that's kind of hard to come by. Where are you going to find a two-page spread like the one we get here?
Yeah, and that's a classic Ditko thing too, where you just cut to the 2 page spread of just like random shapes floating around, and Doctor Strange
Yeah.
is doing stuff. Um, so I was very pleased to see stuff like that. I mean, I would, Marvel in the 60s and really the 60s through the 80s is my favorite era of Marvel. I would have to say this is one of the best things that was published in that time. It's up there with
Yeah.
some of my favorite runs. It's fantastic. Um, you know, I can't say enough good things about it.
Yeah, I agree. Just based on this story, I think this is just as good as all of my favorite Iron Man comics from the 70s. This is great.
Oh wow, that's high praise.
Yeah. And I mean I don't profess to know a lot about Iron Man, but just from the 70s runs that I've read from McElhinney, Layton, and Dennis O'Neil, this is up there. This is just as good in defining of the character as those runs were for Iron Man.
I think so too, and this is a pretty short little run here. I mean, I can't remember if Engelhart did more after this. I'm gonna have to check that out. I don't know off the top of my head, unfortunately. But I think it would be really cool, Steve. Not right away, because we want to have a diverse set of things on the show right out the gate, so people can get a little bit of taste of the all the different stuff we're going to do. But eventually I'd love to go back and do more Doctor Strange with you, because I think this discussion was fantastic, and I think you'd like some of the Ditko stuff as much as this.
Oh, I completely agree. I'm gonna try my hardest to go out and just buy all the masterworks or essentials because they are gonna reprint them now. I
Oh,
just saw a
excellent.
couple listings for them on Marvel's website. So yes, I would love to do that at some point because this stuff is just great. This is really enjoyable, and even if you're not someone that necessarily likes high concept writing, I'd advise you to check it out just to kind of broaden your horizon and see the weird area of the Marvel universe that no one talks about.
Yeah, and weird is the understatement of the year on this. This is like I don't know that there's a word to adequately describe how weird this book is, but I love it because of it. Because
I agree.
we're weird people.
I agree. This is really fun. This is really strange. And it gets you out of your comfort zone. It's a fun experiment.
Yeah, that's great. So, Steve, on this show, what we do is we alternate every week. You pick something, I pick something. We discuss it, and we're trying to expose ourselves to new stuff. Steve hasn't told me ahead of time what he chose for this week. Usually we discuss it ahead of time, and I just kind of flaked and forgot to ask him about it.
Oh
So,
yeah.
so I am very interested to hear what you're going to be picking for next week, Steve.
It took me all week to come up with something because I had so many suggestions I wanted to bring up. I don't want to make this the comic book review show, so I'm gonna put off what my primary recommendation was until my next turn.
Okay.
But since we talked about Doctor Strange and we talked about Benedict Cumberbatch, would it be cool with you if we talk about the first episode of Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman called A Study in Pink?
I would love to. I've watched a little bit of that show at my friend's house. I think it was even the first episode. I watched a little bit of it, and I thought it was phenomenal. So,
Oh yeah.
yes, I would love to do that. That sounds fantastic.
Yes, if people are wondering, you can go to Netflix or Amazon or whatever. It's just the first episode of the very first season. The show's constructed in such a way that every season's 3 episodes, and every episode is a 90-minute movie. And I will say, because I love Sherlock Holmes, I've read all the books multiple times. I think this is the best Sherlock Holmes work since the original writing. That story, A Study in Pink, is better than the original story it's based on.
Wow, that's high praise. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
So this will be fun. I think you'll really enjoy it. It's a great ride, and it's what got Benedict Cumberbatch on the map.
And I think we'll get a little bit of an insight as to how he might play Doctor Strange, because obviously they're completely different characters in the way Cumberbatch plays Sherlock Holmes in the show. He's really eccentric. I don't think Doctor Strange will be that eccentric, but um, a character that's sort of investigator of the weird and off the beaten path.
Yeah.
He is in that, so it'll be interesting to see, and I can't wait to talk about it with you, Steve. Great choice.
Yeah, I agree. This is gonna be lots of fun, and thanks for recommending Doctor Strange. Because this was great. I've never read this, and I can't believe I didn't even touch it before. It's so good.
Oh, no problem. I'm glad you liked it as much as you did. We're hitting it out of the park with our choices every week. It seems like I'm loving what you're my you're loving what I'm picking. Everybody's happy.
Oh yeah, this is gonna be pretty fun.
All right, so before we sign off here, I just want to do my closing ramble. So I want to thank everyone for watching the show, first of all. We really appreciate it. We're a new show here on Geekvolution, trying to grow our audience. I guess helping Captain Logan grow his audience as well, because we're all friends and comrades in arms here. So definitely leave a comment if you have any suggestions for us. We're new at this whole hosting a show thing, so if there's any suggestions that you guys have to make us a little bit better, make the show move a little bit faster, smoother, whatever for you, definitely leave constructive criticism in the comments. Don't be mean, please. We'll try to keep your positive, constructive criticism into account for sure. Let us know if you've read the book, what you think of it. We'd love to hear if we inspired anyone to pick up the book and what you thought of it after you finished reading it. And we'd like to hear your general thoughts on what we're doing for next week, too, and suggestions and requests as well. Like I always say, we can't promise that we'll do everything you suggest, but it's definitely a great idea to throw suggestions out at us, because I think, more ideas the better, and you guys might think of something that'd be cool that we, just the two of us wouldn't have been able to think of. So,
Yeah, and I mean, I've opened it up on Twitter. I talked to people today saying, what would you like us to review on the show? I got a number of suggestions, and they're all on the list, so please keep them coming.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So I think that's all I have to say. Anything that you would like to say before we sign off, Steve?
No. If anyone wants to actually go out and buy this book, be wary of price, because it is out of print. So it is a little bit harder to find, but if your comic book shop has it, even if you're not necessarily a Doctor Strange fan, I'd recommend picking it up just for the value of having it in your collection.
I think it's collected in some of the Essential Doctor Stranges and in one of the out-of-print masterworks. So if you want to know the issue numbers, we can provide you with them in the comments, and you can look up what volume of Essential it's in and what masterwork volume that it's in. But get your hands on it in any way you can. It's
Yes.
It's very, very good. All right, so I think we're going to sign off here. We'll see you guys next week. I have been Dan.
And I have been Steve.
Take it easy, guys. Bye.